Muito bom dia, bem-vindos. Bem-vindos à grande festa das ideias, organizada pela Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, a que a TVI se associa mais uma vez. Nas sociedades livres, toda a gente tem opiniões sobre a democracia. É o que temos, dizem uns. Está podre, algo tem de mudar, dizem outros quantos. E também há bastantes que dizem eles, os agentes políticos da democracia, os governantes, eles bem sabem falar, mas não conseguem ou não sabem praticar aquilo que apregoam. Também é fácil encontrar, além de opiniões, é fácil encontrar citações sobre a democracia. Apesar de ser tão fácil, nós resistimos a essa tentação e fomos um pouco mais atrás. Fomos à origem grega da democracia. Então é assim. Aqui em Atenas, agimos assim. Porque o nosso governo favorece a maioria dos cidadãos e não serve apenas os interesses de uns poucos, damos-lhe o nome de democracia. As leis em Atenas garantem que a justiça seja igual para todos nas suas disputas privadas. No entanto, não ignoramos o valor dos excelentes. Quando um cidadão se distingue pelas suas qualidades, será, de preferência, a qualquer outro chamado a servir a cidade, não como um privilégio, mas como um reconhecimento do seu mérito, não constituindo a escassez de recursos um obstáculo a que tal aconteça. A liberdade de que gozamos estende-se à vida cotidiana. Não desconfiamos uns dos outros e não impedimos que os nossos vizinhos vivam de acordo com as suas preferências. Somos livres. Um cidadão ateniense não negligencia os assuntos públicos para se ocupar dos seus assuntos privados, mas não trata das questões públicas para resolver as suas questões privadas. Ensinaram-nos a respeitar os magistrados da cidade e ensinaram-nos a respeitar as leis, sobretudo aquelas que protegem os que sofreram ofensas. E consideramos inútil e não inócuo o cidadão que se não interessa pela vida do Estado. Não somos daqueles que pensam que a discussão entrava a democracia e acreditamos que não há felicidade sem liberdade, nem liberdade sem audácia. É uma adaptação do discurso de Péricles, escrito algures em 430 a.C., em memória dos mortos da Guerra do Peloponeso. E é com este regresso ao futuro que vos dou então as boas-vindas a este encontro de ideias, organizado pela Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. Mais do que isso, como nós de resto nos temos vindo a habituar a chamar-lhe, a grande festa das ideias, porque as ideias merecem ser celebradas. Este ano perguntamos então que democracia? E dou a palavra ao Presidente da Fundação, Jaime Gama.
Bom dia a todos e a todas. Queria cumprimentá-los e desejar-vos as boas-vindas em nome da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. Neste dia que passareis connosco, ireis seguramente ter a oportunidade de debater um dos temas mais importantes da reflexão contemporânea. Que democracia? A Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos iniciou um conjunto de grandes debates sobre temas de profunda atualidade. Falamos sobre população, falamos sobre Europa, falamos sobre liberdade, falamos sobre tecnologia e falamos sobre ciência. Foram os nossos grandes debates anuais. Este ano, o nosso debate é sobre a temática da democracia. Situarei muito brevemente o debate. Não se trata de perspectivar a democracia numa ótica de apologia ou proselitismo. Não é essa a nossa cruzada. Também não se trata de defender ou problematizar a democracia na perspectiva de uma negação dos totalitarismos ou dos autoritarismos. Não se trata, portanto, de estabelecer uma reflexão sobre a democracia numa ótica desconstrutiva. Também não procuraremos a democracia com a angústia com a indagação metafísica dos que se centram nas temáticas, nas grandes temáticas da fundamentação da democracia. Não é esse o nosso objetivo. Podemos dizer, vendo o programa, que este nosso debate tem uma perspectiva crítica. Crítica no sentido em que poderíamos dizer de um debate desta natureza, se fôssemos sartrianos, que seria um debate que bem poderíamos intitular Crítica da Razão Democrática. Se fôssemos adeptos de Merleau-Ponty, poderíamos intitulá-lo Crítica da Percepção Democrática. E se fôssemos heideggerianos, poderíamos intitulá-lo Crítica da Experiência Democrática. Portanto, a perspectiva é uma perspectiva crítica de quem se situa claramente numa área de exigência e autoaperfeiçoamento da democracia, propugnando um caminho de reformas. O nosso quadro de referência é, portanto, o daqueles que continuam a situar-se e a mover-se na ordem liberal-democrática do Ocidente, para sintetizar em palavras simples. E aí, a nossa comissão científica, que detalhadamente preparou o encontro, presidida pela professora Lúcia Amaral, ela mesma expressão de um vasto conjunto de personalidades com perspectivas muito diferenciadas sobre o problema, recolheu contributos de autores que se destacaram e destacam no campo da ciência política, da teoria política, do direito, da sociologia, do ensaio. E quisemos incorporar também as perspectivas para esta discussão trazidas pela arte, pela estética, pela música e pelo cinema. Ou seja, um debate preparado por uma comissão científica plural, um leque de oradores e de intervenientes plural e um público também seguramente plural. E não se assustem quando virem os nossos cartazes de publicidade. Todo o evento tem que ter também um suporte de comunicação. Quando eles dizem ou titulam "O debate está na rua", isso não significa que iremos sair daqui com o objetivo de, através de uma manifestação, lançar qualquer espécie de movimento. Quando nós dizemos "o debate está na rua", aquilo que queremos significar é que a Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos está presente na vida portuguesa de uma forma independente, dinâmica, propositiva, responsável, e que está presente com a força, a vitalidade de um dos grandes intervenientes que estará connosco ao fim da tarde, que é Mário Vargas Llosa, na sua trajetória de exigência, de procura estética, filosófica e pessoal. Bom debate, espero que vos agrade o programa que foi preparado para este dia de reflexão em torno da democracia. Muito obrigado a todos.
Muito bom dia a todos. Foi há pouco mais de um ano, algures durante a primavera de 2015, que a Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos nos pediu, a mim e a um grupo muito diversificado de pessoas, que que imaginássemos como é que poderia ser a organização de um dia inteiro dedicado ao debate do tema nada mais, nada menos do que democracia. Aceitámos. E como o referido dia deveria calhar no calendário do outono do ano seguinte, ou seja, agora, começámos a trabalhar pouco tempo depois. O grupo era, de facto, muito diversificado. Compunham-no a Catarina Roseta Palma, Catherine Morri, Feliz Bela Lopes, Francisco Seixas da Costa, Miguel Nogueira de Brito, Nuno Garopa, Pedro Magalhães, Pedro Mexia, Pedro Vicente, 3 Pedros, Serena Cabrita Neto, Ravi Afonso Pereira e eu própria. Tínhamos idades diferentes, formações diferentes, interesses muito diversos. De modo que, assim que começámos a trabalhar, aconteceu o que era previsível que acontecesse. Havia acordo entre nós todos quanto à absoluta necessidade de debater a democracia. Acordo quanto ao método de organização de debate é que não havia nenhum. Todos tínhamos perguntas, e muitas. Como explicar o desinteresse crescente da maior parte das pessoas pela participação cívica, política e eleitoral, como demonstram as taxas elevadas de abstenção? Como voltar a interessar os jovens por estes assuntos? Como explicar a importância crescente que nas democracias contemporâneas têm as decisões do Poder Judicial? Será que as redes sociais vão transformar a qualidade dos debates democráticos? A globalização afeta a democracia? Os fluxos migratórios transformá-la-ão? Eis alguns dos exemplos das muitas perguntas que cada um tinha por fazer, sendo que cada um também pensava que era a partir do seu próprio modo de visão das coisas que as coisas deveriam ser vistas. Nada que não seja natural, nada que não aconteça sempre que a um grupo diverso de pessoas é pedido que livremente encetem uma tarefa conjunta. De modo que nós depressa nos percebemos que se nos deixássemos instalar naquela muito democrática babel de línguas que se tinha instalado entre nós, não conseguiríamos, no período de tempo de que dispunhamos, de realizar tarefa nenhuma, decidir sobre coisa nenhuma. E por isso procuramos um vocabulário comum, um léxico comum, algo que permitisse fazer a ponte, estabelecer o fio de Ariane entre as visões diferentes de que partíamos. Chamámos a esse léxico comum o léxico básico da democracia. Aquele conjunto de palavras ou expressões, um conjunto mínimo, cujo significado é o das ideias sempre associadas à palavra democracia, qualquer que seja o sentido que cada um pense dever atribuir-lhe. Assim com a ideia de povo, assim com a ideia de representação política, ou seja, de mandato que conferimos àqueles que nos governam e pelo exercício do qual exigimos que nos prestem contas. Assim com a ideia de espaço público, onde se travam as discussões democráticas e onde se agregam maiorias. E assim com a ideia de justiça social, sem a qual a palavra igualdade democrática não adquire sentido nenhum. Não deixámos de ter perguntas e muito menos procurámos obter respostas ou fazer dessas respostas que obteríamos o assunto destas jornadas. Limitámo-nos a organizar as perguntas que todos tínhamos em torno deste léxico básico. E é isso que explica a sucessão de debates que vos vamos oferecer ao longo deste dia. É claro que, para além de todas as questões que eu já enumerei, há outras duas, intuitivas, diria eu, que se nos colocam naturalmente. Uma é relativa ao futuro. Que mundo vamos deixar para quem vier depois de nós? Esse será o tema da sessão de encerramento. A outra é relativa, digamos assim, ao presente. Será que nós pensamos, de facto, que a democracia é melhor do que qualquer outra alternativa? Preferimos-la como modo de organização da vida coletiva? Se sim, por que motivo? E de que modo é que esta forma de organização de vida coletiva que preferimos como motivo está hoje universalizável, ou universalizada, ou é ela universalizável? Este será o tema da conferência de abertura, à qual passamos imediatamente e em relação à qual tenho eu, a partir de agora, o maior gosto de vos apresentar o seu autor, o professor Shapiro. O professor Shapiro nasceu na África do Sul e é, desde 1984, professor de Ciência Política na Universidade de Yale, nos Estados Unidos. É um intelectual conhecido pela sua vastíssima obra, que incide, sobretudo, sobre o estudo erudito dos fundamentos filosóficos dos diferentes regimes políticos, em geral, e da democracia em particular, sobre o estudo igualmente erudito das diferentes concepções teóricas que existem sobre a democracia, chamadas teorias da democracia, das relações entre democracia e justiça, das relações entre processos de decisão democrática e políticas de redistribuição de rendimentos e de garantia do bem-estar social. Vou nomear apenas algumas dessa vastíssima bibliografia, algumas dessas obras. Democratic Justice, de 1999, The Moral Foundations of Politics, de 2003, The State of Democratic Theory, também de 2003, The Real World of Democratic Theory, 2011, e agora, do ano 2016, Politics Against Domination. O professor Shapiro é membro de inúmeras academias. Vou salientar apenas a Academia Americana de Letras e Ciências, de Artes e Ciências, a Sociedade Americana de Filosofia. É professor em Yale, mas foi também professor visitante das universidades de Tóquio, da Cidade do Cabo e em Oxford. Professor Shapiro, the floor is yours. Muito obrigada.
Good morning. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be here today to talk about Democratic Challenges 2016 and beyond. I'm going to begin with a very focused example of the challenges of 2016. But before I do that, I do want to spend a minute to say, in these times of anxiety about democracy, that We should remember that the world has become substantially more democratic in the last several decades. That gives you a sense of the spread of democracy across the world. But also, if we look at the number of democracies that have developed over the past 2 centuries, you can see a quite staggering increase in the last several decades. This is in the number of democracies, and if we compare what we call anocracies and autocracies, anocracies are sort of in between democracy and dictatorship, or democracy and autocracy, we can see that there's been a very substantial decline. And right around the beginning of the 21st century, the number of democracies in the world actually exceeded the number of non-democracies for the first time. If we look at people in the world, we see a comparable picture, that if you look at the world, the population of the world, you can see that the number of people living in democracies has really increased quite phenomenally since the Second World War. And as a proportion of the people on the globe, while there's still many more people living in non-democratic regimes than in democratic regimes, it's nonetheless the case that many more people are living in democracies than ever before. And it's important, I think, to remind ourselves of these basic statistics when we talk about some of the challenges of democracy or the challenges to democracy that we are confronting at the present time. To put a human face on the challenges, the challenge of 2016, of course, is the prospect that Donald Trump is actually a serious candidate for the presidency of the United States. And I'm going to focus not so much on Trump himself, but on the forces that have given rise to Donald Trump, because no matter how the U.S. election plays itself out over the next 5 weeks, the forces that have given rise to the very possibility of somebody like this winning the presidency of the United States, those forces are not going to go away. And so the challenge of 2016, I think, is not aberrational, and we really have to dig a little bit deeper and ask ourselves, what is it that actually produced Trump in the first place? So I'm going to begin by speaking about that. And the more familiar story I'm going to spend rather less time on, because it's what we read about in the newspapers all the time. And this is the economic factors that have led to the rise of populism not only in the United States, but across the developed world. And the economic hollowing out, as we call it, is the hollowing out of, in the U.S. case, the white working class and increasingly the white middle class, as 3 forces have come to act upon the social and economic circumstances that gave their parents the sources of a successful life. The first, of course, is the technological revolution. If you go back to the 1950s and 1960s, we found sociologists writing about things like de-skilling and the impact of coming technology on labor practices. But they really didn't have any idea how extreme that was going to be. And in the eras of driverless cars and off-the-shelf software programs that can perform tasks that it used to require a professional degree to perform, what we've seen now is the long-term destruction of employment, far exceeding anything that John Maynard Keynes dreamed of in 1930 when he thought that we would all be heading for an era of filling up our leisure time when work would have become obsolete. So the technological changes that have come as a byproduct of the IT revolution are profound, and they're reshaping the terrain of work in ways that are leaving behind those who are not on the right side of the skills revolution. And that's one important source of the economic hollowing out, as I'm calling it. The second, of course, is globalization. As the movement of capital outstrips the movement of labor by increasing proportions, you have the offshoring, we used to call it outsourcing, of jobs. And the most significant development of the last decade or so is that the outsourcing of labor has moved from blue-collar jobs, from traditional working-class jobs, into traditional white-collar occupations. So to give you an example, in 10 or 15 years ago even, perhaps, if you were going to apply for a mortgage on a house, what you would do is go down to the local bank. You would have a meeting with a regional bank manager who would be somebody with an advanced training. He or she, probably he in those days, would have a university degree. They would know you, they would size you up, they would decide whether you were a good bet for a mortgage, and you would have a relationship with that professional. Today, if you want to apply for a mortgage, you'll do it over the internet or over the phone to a technician who will type your application into a piece of software. That technician might be in Bangalore or who knows where, and that bank manager's job has long since disappeared. And so the hollowing out of the traditional working class has crept up and now is increasingly the hollowing out of the middle class. When we look at the typical Trump voter in the United States, the median income of the typical Trump voter is $68,000 a year, quite a lot higher than most people imagine who think it's simply the white working class who are part of this revolt against the elites. So that's the second major source, is globalization. You see it in the reaction against globalization, so that both now Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, under pressure from Bernard Sanders in the primaries, are strongly opposed to trade agreements, to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Barack Obama has negotiated, even though it's really a device for the U.S. to protect jobs in the Far East from China. It goes little commented upon that China would not be part of the TPP. So it's not as threatening to American interests as many people seem to presume. Nonetheless, there's this virulent hostility to trade agreements driving the U.S. election, because people believe that this has led to the destruction of American jobs, and they're offshoring to Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Then the third source of the economic hollowing out is associated with the publication of Thomas Piketty's book, Capitalism in the 21st Century. And this is the observation that drives his analysis, that returns to capital exceed returns to other factors of production, so we're getting an increasing amount of capital concentrated at the top. And these three factors, trade, technology, and returns to capital, are the main economic sources of the anguish among the traditional, in the U.S. case, white working and increasingly white middle class who are reacting against elites and being appealed to by populist figures, both on the left and on the right. Of course, if we were talking about Europe, we would add another feature to this, which is refugees and immigration. And although that is much talked about in the U.S., it's actually much less of a factor in the U.S. than it is in Europe. But rather than comment further on the economics, I want to turn to the politics of the populist backlash. And I want to talk a little bit about some things that you wouldn't regularly be reading about in the newspapers, but that I would argue have actually had a profound effect on the rise of populism in the US, in the UK, and indeed in much of Europe. And this goes under the broad heading that I'm calling here bad democratic practices, but the basic idea is that a misguided notion of increasing democracy within political parties has produced a circumstance in which they are now hostage to populist takeovers. And it's an example of a broader phenomenon, particularly in American politics, whereby instruments of direct democracy and ways of trying to increase public participation tend to be dreamed up on the starry-eyed left and then hijacked by the cynical right for their own purposes. So I want to talk a little bit in a little bit of detail about that to give you a sense of what this means. I'm going to start with a two-party system, which is what we have in the United States, even though, and they have in the UK, even though the story is somewhat different once you have proportional representation, which produces many political parties, or more than two at any rate. But the basic dynamic I'm talking about plays out whether you have proportional representation or not. But starting, if you have a two-party system, we have in political science something that we call the median voter theorem, which is that you can imagine a left-wing party illustrated here in blue and a right-wing party, and the normal distribution or the shape of the curve tells you that most people are somewhere in the middle. Most voters are somewhere in the middle with decreasing numbers as we go out toward the extremes. In such a system, politicians who are trying to get elected are going to mostly be in search of the median voter because that's where the most votes are, precisely because most voters are somewhere in the middle. It's, in that sense, a normal distribution. Of course, they could get it wrong. So if you go back in the US case to 1964, we had incumbent President Lyndon Johnson running against Barry Goldwater, who was a very right-wing Republican, and he was actually somewhere way out here, where I've marked with the line next to the B. And what happened was he lost in a landslide to Lyndon Johnson, precisely because he was so far from the median voter that the Democrats were able to take many votes that would normally have gone to a Republican. Of course, sometimes they get it right when people think they've gotten it wrong. So in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was running against incumbent President Jimmy Carter, many people said, "Why is Reagan such a fool? He's running on exactly the same program as Barry Goldwater ran on in 1964, and look what happened to him." But of course, the difference was that the median voter had moved by 1980, and whether Reagan was brilliant or lucky, we're not certain, but it turned out that the program that had been such a disaster for Barry Goldwater was not a disaster for Ronald Reagan at all. So politicians don't always get it right, but the general assumption is that they're looking for the median voter to find the source of access to office and power. Now, when you introduce democracy into political parties, things begin to change. This happened in the US starting really in 1968. 1968, it was the height of the Vietnam War, huge disaffection with political elites, not that unlike the kind of disaffection that we're seeing today. There were riots in the streets in the city of Chicago after the Democratic National Convention, and that produced something called the McGovern-Fraser Commission, a commission designed to reform Democratic parties' selection processes, to democratize them. The slogan was, we need to get rid of the smoke-filled rooms where backroom deals are done and candidates are selected, and instead we should have popular participation in the selection of candidates. And so you had the rise of primaries and caucuses. These had existed during the progressive era in the US, but had largely gone into decline. And until the 1960s, you certainly didn't have to do particularly well in primaries in order to become selected as a candidate for office. But starting after the McGovern-Fraser reforms, there was a huge push to democratize the selection of candidates through primaries. And so we saw this massive increase in the use of primaries thereafter. But of course, if you think about primaries, primaries are they're looking for the median voter in their party, right? If you're trying to win a primary, the Republican Party in the U.S. case and the Democratic Party in the U.S. case are made up themselves of relatively normal distributions of voters, and in order to win election as selection as the candidate for your party, you first have to find the median voter in the party. Or so it might appear. What is in fact the case is it's almost universally true that activists within parties tend to be more intense and more extreme than regular voters. And so that means that activists turn out and work and raise money and go to meetings at a higher rate than regular voters in a political party. So if you look, it's not even the case that the median voter in the party ends up selecting the candidate, but somebody significantly to the left in the case of the Democrats or to the right in the case of Republicans of the median voter in the party ends up selecting the candidate. So what you have in the case of Trump, for example, some 13.4 million people voted for Trump in the Republican primaries. And as the Republican primaries went along, turnout actually decreased. In the last dozen or so Republican primaries, turnout fell well below 20%, even below 15% of members of the Republican Party. And so you have this situation that we've now reached where about 5% of the United States electorate, those 13.4 million, about 5% of the electorate, actually chose the candidate who's running for the Republican nomination. And so you get this, as I said, misguided conception of democracy driving a process whereby, in fact, extreme elements within the party end up making the selection. And so while the Republicans followed the lead of the Democrats after 1968 in decentralizing their selection processes, I think they have very much come to regret it. That's something to which I will return. But I want to comment a little bit further on this decentralization of selection to political parties before I do that. One is that it produces what we call intra-party competition, that is competition within political parties, rather than inter-party competition, which is competition between political parties. And competition within political parties is generally unhealthy for democracy because it produces clientelism. It produces people appealing to narrower and narrower segments of the electorate in terms of their narrow sectoral interests, rather than to policies that would be arguably good for the country as a whole if their party were to win office. But secondly, it undermines the legitimacy of governments by producing polarization in the politicians who get selected. Because what actually happens is, for instance, we have these primaries not only for the selection of presidential candidates, but also for the selection of candidates to the legislature. And what that means is that for instance, in the Republican Party, the far right, the so-called Tea Party, selects the candidates for Congress and for the Senate, and they do that in seats that are almost all safe seats. That is, more than 90% of the seats are not really seriously contested in the general election, so that the only real contest in these seats is the primary contest. Whoever wins the primaries in most southern states is going to, in the Republican Party, is going to be the candidate. Whoever wins the Democratic primaries in a state like Connecticut is going to be the congressperson from that district. So it's all about the primaries. And so what happens is, once the far right of the Republican Party and the far left of the Democratic Party are selecting the people who go to Congress, they get there, and of course it's impossible for them to govern because they have so little overlap. And whenever they finally manage to compromise on something, they lose legitimacy because the people who've selected them feel betrayed. The people who've selected them rightly feel betrayed because they say, we selected you to go to Washington to change the status quo, and now you've become part of the status quo. You're compromising with those evil people on the other side, and we're going to make a primary challenge against you. So even a very conservative leader like John Boehner in the House was bumped off by challenges from Republican primary voters. So it creates a system in which, even though the population is somewhat more polarized than it was 30 years ago, the political representatives are much more polarized than they were 30 years ago, and that's almost exclusively an artifact of this change in nominating systems. Now, this is not exclusively a US story. If you think about the UK for a minute, what you'll find in the United Kingdom is a very similar dynamic at work. It used to be the case that the leader of the Conservative Party somehow emerged out of discussions in the parliamentary party. Now they have a system where the person is elected, and eventually, when they get it down to 2, it's supposed to be the case that it's then sent out to the Tory party membership for a vote. That was short-circuited this time because Michael Gove committed a murder-suicide of attacking his ally Boris Johnson before rendering himself unavailable by having done that. So they never had the vote. But if they had followed their own rules, they would have ended up with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, who would have been much further from the median voter in British politics than Theresa May. And in the Labour Party, a very similar dynamic to the Democratic Party, to the Republican Party in the US, where many years in the wilderness, under Michael Foot and others, produced a desire to modernize and centralize the Labour Party. And so you got Neil Kinnock, John Smith, and eventually Tony Blair centralizing control and producing a candidate who could actually win an election. In the case of Blair, and he won actually 3 elections, and Labour became a viable party of government. But then, partly in reaction against the neoliberalism of New Labour, we had a resurgence of the argument for more democratization within the Labour Party, culminating in Ed Miliband's putting into place these new rules of direct election of the leader of the Labour Party. And that has produced the anomaly that we now see before us, where this summer Jeremy Corbyn lost a vote of no confidence in the Parliamentary Labour Party by 172 to 40. That would normally be the death of a party leader in the British system. But Corbyn was nonetheless just re-elected by the membership with a majority of 61.2%. And so this creates a completely dysfunctional Labour Party, whereby the Parliamentary Labour Party is fairly close to the median voter in British politics, but the leadership of the Labour Party is far to the left. We saw it also with the Brexit vote. If you look at all of the polling before and after Brexit, it seems pretty clear that the median voter in Britain was in favor of Remain. But the activists and the extreme people with extreme views about departing turned out at significantly higher rates, and so you got a majority on the referendum day to leave. And referendums are really a natural extension of this idea of decentralizing control of political decisions, even further than decentralizing them for the selection of candidates. Again, it looks like a great democratic innovation. The people should decide. We should have referenda. But when it gets down to it, the more extreme people and the more intense people are going to turn out at disproportionately higher rates and determine the result. These are both Anglo-American systems, and I'll just say a couple of words about PR. Basically the same dynamic happens. Of course, in PR, you have more parties, and that by itself, even before we talk about the decentralization of selection processes, having more parties can often empower minorities to have a decisive say on electoral outcomes. If a minority party is necessary for an explicit coalition, or as you now have an implicit coalition, they can exert huge control over the direction of the government out of all proportion to their representation in the electorate. We see this all the time in Israel, where right-wing religious parties, for example, are often essential to form a coalition, and so they can exert disproportionate influence on the outcome. Again, people have a misguided idea that proportional representation is a good thing because more people have their representatives who are close to them ideologically elected to the legislature, but the reality is that a government has to be formed, and it's maybe more representative at the electoral moment, but it's less representative at the governing moment. And when you have the combination of PR and decentralized selection, you get the worst of all worlds, which we now see in Israel again because they have introduced primaries. They've combined PR with primaries, if you can even get your mind around that. And so we have the extreme elements within the extreme parties determining the course of the government. And so it's a cautionary word for those thinking about the pressures. I know not that much about Portuguese politics, but I see that since 2000, there's also been pressure here to democratize the selection of leaderships and candidates within the political parties. And all I can say is look across the channel and look across the Atlantic and be warned. A couple of points about how this has been playing out in the US, and we'll come back to the Trump challenge. So, as the Democrats realized that their introduction of primaries into the process had led to a situation where they were producing unelectable candidates. As I said, George McGovern lost by a landslide, I think 49 out of 50 states in 1972, despite being a product of this new decentralized selection system. They created something called superdelegates, and the superdelegates are selected by the party insiders, by the party hierarchy, by the descendants, if you like, of the smoke-filled rooms. And the idea was to counteract this populist impulse that gets going in the primaries. And so the superdelegates in the Democratic Party essentially saved Hillary Clinton from Bernie Sanders. But for the superdelegates, the amount of momentum Sanders had generated during the early primaries would have produced a similar result that we saw in 2008 when President Obama, now President Obama, defeated Hillary Clinton as well. She thought she had the superdelegates locked up, but Obama was such a compelling candidate that eventually they abandoned Hillary for him. But that led, indeed, that very experience, the second time around, led the Clinton people to lock up the superdelegates very early, and they were all committed to her from the beginning, and the vast majority of them supported her and were known to be supporting her all through the process, and that made the decisive difference. The evidence that made the decisive difference can be seen from the deal that she made with Sanders in order to get his support this time around. Trump, in deriding Sanders, one of his applause lines is that Sanders made a deal with the devil in order to get recognition from Clinton. Actually, you could say it's the other way around. Hillary Clinton made a deal with the devil in the agreement she made with Sanders, because a significant part of that deal is to disempower the superdelegates in the Democratic Party next time around. Next time around won't matter to Hillary because she'll either be an incumbent running for re-election or she'll be long gone from the political process. But basically, 3/4 of the superdelegates now are going to be unbound. That's going to mean that they're not going to be required to support the establishment candidate or the candidate that might be closer to the median voter, and they will not be able to protect the party from the sort of insurgency that Sanders represented on the Democratic side and that Trump represents on the Republican side. Because the Republicans did this after the previous election cycle. They disempowered their superdelegates. The Republican superdelegates are completely bound by the results of the primaries and caucuses, and so were unable to be a bulwark against the Trump insurgency. And so what that will mean is, I think, that the Democrats next time around will be more vulnerable to a hostile takeover by a group representing maybe 5% of the electorate. So what's the impact of all of this likely to be? Of course, it's difficult to say. That famous American Yogi Berra once said, predictions are difficult, especially about the future. But I think if Trump were to win, which seems unlikely, it seems that the odds are against that. It's certainly, if you look at the polls of polls and the betting averages and the betting markets, it's sort of between 3-1 and 4-1 against the probability of Trump winning. If he did win, I think it would split the Republican Party, and we would be back to something like what was going on in the 1850s, which is when the current party system emerged. That would probably have knock-on effects in the Democratic Party as well that would be unpredictable. If he loses, which seems more likely, there will certainly be a revolution in the governance of the Republican Party, and there I would predict they will actually re-empower their superdelegates to make sure that this can't happen to them next time around. But so a couple of remarks in conclusion now. I think one thing you can see from this narrative that I've given you is that reformers tend always to be fighting the last war. They're always reforming the process in response to what are perceived to be the pathologies of the most recent debacle that they have confronted. And it would be actually much better to take a little bit of a step back and ask what are the healthiest kinds of political parties? What are the sorts of political parties that make democracy function best? And my argument would be that large, strong parties are better. And so, in the end of the day, single-member district systems are better than PR for that reason, because they tend to produce two parties most of the time. So long as the diversity within constituencies is similar to the diversity within the nation, they produce two parties. If there's big regional diversity, as you have in India, then single-member district systems won't produce two parties. But for the most part, they produce two parties. And it's much better for them to be strong parties, controlled by and disciplined by the leaderships of those parties for two reasons. One is that you will then get competition over the ideas that are actually likely to govern if the government wins, as opposed to the ideas that are hammered out in a post-election deal among political parties, or not even made explicit if you have the sort of situation you have in Portugal today, where the government must govern in the shadow of a possible revolt from parties to its left that could bring it down at any minute. So I think single-member district systems are better because they tend to produce two parties that compete over the philosophies that will actually govern when the party that wins office wins. And secondly, if you have large, strong parties, the people who run them are much more likely to be thinking about the longer-term interests of the political party than short-term tactical gains that can get them the next election. And in the long run, that's more likely to produce the kind of contestation of ideas that is most healthy for democracy. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to listening to the rest of the discussion today.